Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you so much for taking the time to be here this afternoon to talk about what it is that we have learned over the last 10 years since 9/11. My name is Reverend Joshua Longbottom. I am an associate pastor at Plymouth Congregational Church, and I am just here to help host this event and be helpful in any way. If there's something I can do for you, just grab me and ask. It has been 10 years since the tragedy of 9/11. And pretty much all of us in one way or another have been touched by this event, whether it is at home or abroad. There's still lots to discuss, what we can do to prevent another 9/11 from happening, and what it will take of us to bring peace someday around this globe. We are very privileged to be joined by a distinguished set of panelists today, by Sheriff Ken McGovern, by Dr. David Gottlieb, and by Dr. Brent Steele. We're also privileged to have this location and event set up for us by the sponsoring organizations, the Institute of Interfaith Dialog, which you can ask more questions about at that table in the back. It's a nonprofit organization that's primary goal is to bring people together in the community in order to promote compassion, cooperation, partnership, community service, and interfaith dialogue and harmony. This event is also sponsored by the Intercultural and Interfaith Dialog Student Association, which is a Kansas University organization, which you can ask more information about at the back after the event. And it also supports and advances the harmony and cooperation of members of different cultures in Lawrence and traditions and faith. The final group that's sponsoring this event is the Foundation, which is an international journal that discusses a wide range of topics, including Islam, the Muslim world, science, technology, arts, culture, and society. And the last issue was all about remembering 9/11 and what we learned about it, and that is available at the back desk there for free. You can take it with you. There are also a variety of books that you might pick through and take as you leave too. And I also hear that if you sign up, you get a 1-year free subscription to that magazine. The perks. Each of our panelists is going to speak and present for a little while from their perspective about what it is we've learned in the last 10 years and where we have to go. Then after that, we'll have a collective question and answer period that you can participate in. Our first speaker is Sheriff Ken McGovern, and I'd like to introduce him for just a second before he begins to speak. He is a graduate of Lawrence High School here, coming to us from a local setting. Attended the Coffeyville Junior College and also the University of Kansas. He began his career in law enforcement with the Douglas County Sheriff Office in the 80s, serving as a corrections officer, as a corrections supervisor, and eventually as deputy sheriff. In the 90s, he was promoted to the rank of sergeant and lieutenant, and recently as captain. In 2004, Ken was elected the sheriff of the Douglas County. Ken has overseen the implementation of numerous projects and programs aimed at improving service to the community and keeping its members safer and better informed. Some of these include the reentry program, the chaplaincy program at Douglas County Jail, the sex offenders registry and monitoring program, and improvements in technology, community outreach, and finding and locating additional funding for enforcement activities via grants. Without further ado, I'd like Sheriff Ken McGovern to start us off.
Thank you. You want us down here or up there?
That's up.
Whichever you feel more comfortable.
Oh, it doesn't matter to me. You guys do whatever you're going to do. Hopefully everyone can hear me. Also added to that, I'm also a member of the Kansas Sheriff's Association. I'm currently acting as the president of the Kansas Sheriff's Association. Also working with the legislative issues throughout the state that pertain to law enforcement. Over the last 10 years, I still remember, as everyone else, the tragic day, and at that time the mass panic of what to do. Over the several years, we have worked through the Department of Homeland Security, through the State Homeland Security, looking at better ways of the communications that we communicate throughout the state. Currently, our communication centers are divided, trying to make that technology better and more interoperability. Currently with the KU Public Safety, Fire Department, the Police Department, the communications is much improved. Over the several years, we're going to have to improve those facilities. Staffing's the education. One of the big things here recently is part of an education process throughout the state of a diversity training. And the Sheriff's Association and our office are big proponents in it. The diversity we've mandated by state, but we'd already put that place already in gear before it was already mandated by the state guidelines. We're also members of the regional training and equipment centers that's located out of each region has a different set of standards, and so we're part of that also. Technology-wise, we're working with the police department. That's one of the things that I think we have learned was there's so many gaps and burdens on different people. So with the police department and KU, we've sat down and figured out what equipment they have, what's available to us, what gaps are out there that we need to fill. We also work with state agencies and also the federal government, if that so be. We have a lot of more things to accomplish over the next couple years and in the future. So I feel like our agency and any other agency throughout the state need to be on board of that. And I think it's a high priority, and I think we will continue to build those relationships. And how do we, tax dollar wise, make those things work? I think a large part of it is the training. We've had several meetings throughout the community and see, you know, the culture of this city is different from any other in the state of Kansas, and so we have to address that and how we work through those issues. I know Tarek and I have sat down and had issues that we've talked about and how we can help each other, and I think it's become a great relationship. Also with KU, most agencies in the state talk, but you go across the country and some agencies won't even talk because they're even in the same building. I don't think we have those issues in this community, and I don't ever foresee that happening. So if they call us, we're coming, and if we need their help, they'll be there also. So I think those issues won't ever show their ugly head here. Thank you.
Our next panelist is Dr. David Gottlieb. He's a graduate of Georgetown University Law Center. He joined the KU Law faculty in 1979. He teaches international human rights, professional responsibility, criminal procedure, and refugee and asylum law. He's also nationally recognized for his leadership in clinical legal education and has served as a consultant on clinical legal education in the United States and abroad, most recently in the Ukraine, Bulgaria, and Turkey. He was named the 2009 Legal Leader by the Kansas City Daily Record for his role as a legal scholar. And I'd like to welcome you up here too. Thank you.
Most importantly, his middle child was a debater and debated against Reverend Longbottom when they were both in college. Well, I guess I have to start with a bit of an apology, because as I'll explain to you, my at least brief remarks are really more of a summary about what's happened than a view as to what we've learned. I'll be happy to take any questions in the question time, and I did write it this way because I'll give you the third sentence. I know that many of you were in elementary or junior high school at the time, so one of my goals is simply to let you know how you and your world has changed as a result of our response to the attack. So there are fewer undergraduates here than I had expected, and I was designing this to give a bit of a background, but I hope you'll find it useful even if you know most of it. The attacks were very real shocks to most of us, and while there were attacks on United States vessels and facilities that had preceded the 2001 terrorist attacks, and while under the Clinton administration, anti-terror investigation was the chief priority of U.S. Attorney's Office, the country as a whole was shocked by the event. The way in which the terrorist attack was staged was designed to maximize the shock, and the endless repetition on television of the footage made sure that the memories were indelible. The collapse of the towers, which not even the terrorists had predicted, turned the event from a terrible attack to a kind of apocalyptic occurrence. And the anthrax attacks, which followed up a couple of months later, helped convince people in places like Lawrence that they too might be at risk from international terrorism, even though it turned out that the anthrax attacks had not come from an international source. In response to these attacks, we asked not so much for justice as for security. The government at the time did not ask anything of us by way of financial sacrifice or service in particular, but it did ask us to curb what we had previously seen as liberty or just privacy. This is particularly noticeable to us, especially in urban areas, anytime we're in public. Today at airports, we partially undress, taking off our shoes and belts, submitting to pat-downs, and going through x-ray screeners that produce images of our naked body. If you ride in a subway in New York, you may be subject to random screenings of your baggage. In order to walk into a public building, you must have all of your belongings searched, and in many places have an invitation from one of our public officials to enter. In places like New York, you can expect to be photographed by cameras and have your movements monitored almost anywhere you go in the city. While these enhancements have not come yet to Lawrence or even to the cities closest to us, I have no doubt that larger cities, at least throughout the country, are seeking money so that they can add to the surveillance. We've been asked to give up information and privacy in other ways as well. One of the first acts passed by Congress, the Patriot Act, made it easier for government to gather information transmitted by telephone or computer. Quite apart from these public bills, the government immediately after 9/11 commenced a secret data mining effort whose scope is still not known today, which it did abandon, at least in part, prior to 2004. The government significantly increased its ability in cases involving communications beginning or ending outside of the United States to act either without a warrant or pursuant to a warrant granted by a judge in secret. You can certainly expect that a phone call that you place to a friend or relative in London or Rome might be monitored by some computer somewhere. The government's ability to get library records was also significantly expanded. So far I've talked about the costs we've all paid, but there are some who've been singled out for greater scrutiny. You can begin with foreign students whose visa requirements have been more exacting, so much so that for some national origin, this country has ceased to be the destination of choice. For those of Middle Eastern descent, particularly adherents to Islam, there is the possibility that one's place of worship is going to be the target of surveillance. That certainly wasn't the case prior to 2001. And then there are individuals in foreign countries who we believe we can move against as military targets rather than suspected criminals, and rather than elaborate on that, I'll just take questions that you may have on that subject. These additions to the government's public and private monitoring ability, virtually all of which, by the way, were agreed to by the majority of us through Congress, did not come free. We created a new agency, the Department of Homeland Security, the largest agency in the entire federal government. Expenditures for security have mushroomed where other federal spending has not, and a new or almost new industry has been created to produce products and staff for Homeland Security. We've all paid for this industry in the opportunity costs of roads not built, bridges not repaired, and the entire laundry list of things that we are told are too expensive to do. While the government's asked more of us, it has assumed more and more power to shield its decisions from our view. Litigation against government interrogation practices such as waterboarding or government surveillance practices such as warrantless spying has been stymied by assertions that even to litigate the matters would damage national security. We don't know quite what the government is doing to keep us safe, and it's fair to say that many or most of us don't want to know. Once these measures are taken, there seems to be no way to rein them in. No individual wants to be the person who took the act that let terrorists communicate or get on a plane, let alone give up the grant money helping implement these policies. And so this new Cold War against a tiny band of individuals who have no weapons greater than conventional explosives seems destined to go on for decades. 10 years on, we're a country whose politics seem more driven by fear, a decade of color-coded warnings that bear little, often connection to actual events or dangers. And the result of this increase in security and government secrecy is also to have put actual physical barriers between ourselves and our government. You'll hear in our national political dialogue constant references to how government officials are out of touch with the feelings and concerns of the rest of us. I can't tell you how much of this is caused by the fact of the actual physical separation between us and our representatives, but I can tell you that that separation is taking place and that has grown immeasurably as a result of the security measures taken after September 11th. And this obviously is not the case so much in Lawrence, but if you go to a major city, or particularly to Washington, D.C., the government has really walled itself off in a physical sense because of the issues with security. I think it's always appropriate to ask how much of this we really need to engage in a dialogue with each other and with the government to explain what it's doing in the name of security, and to ask ourselves whether this is the one and only area in our lives where no amount of action taken to protect us against danger is too much.
Thank you, Dr. Gottlieb. I'd also like to welcome next Dr. Brent Steele, Associate Professor of Political Science. He received his BA and Master's of Political Science from the University of Northern Iowa and his PhD from the University of Iowa. His publications have appeared in numerous journals, including the International Political Science Review, Millennium, and the Review of International Studies. He is the author of 2 books and the co-editor of 2 others. His most recent book, Defacing Power, The Aesthetics of Insecurity in Global Politics, focuses on U.S. foreign policy practices and debates since 9/11. Dr. Brent Steele, please.
Thank you very much. Thank you all for being here. Thanks to the IID and the IIDSA for putting this on, and the individuals that put it on, Ali and the Reverend, and my fellow panelists. It's very nice to meet you and hear what you have to say. I'll try not to go too long. I have a little bit longer of remarks, so Reverend, if I'm going a little bit too long, just give me the hook and I'll make sure to sit down. So I actually have 5 specific lessons that I think that I took from 9/11 as someone who studies U.S. foreign policy, international politics, and the like, and so I'm sort of moving out even broader than even some of the other fellow panelists, the terrain that they were on. But as a way to start, I'm teaching an Intro to International Politics course this fall, and I teach it once every few semesters, so that has a lot of freshmen and sophomore students in it. And what I always do at the beginning of the semester is I survey them on their first international political event that they remember in their lifetimes. And this is the first year that a clear majority of them, so this gets back to, I think, what was mentioned by Professor Gottlieb in terms of where undergraduates are. A clear majority of them for the first time picked 9/11 as the first international political event. And it was about 85 out of 150 students. And then the next highest response after that, about a quarter of them picked OIF, Operation Iraqi Freedom, or the Iraq War. So I think that does give us an example of where these students are that we're teaching here in terms of their formative experiences or where they started becoming aware of international politics. Now, 2 of them picked Germany invading Poland, so I'm not exactly sure if I have a really diverse student body or if they didn't understand the question very well, but they really did. So the 5 lessons, let me state them up front, and that way if I don't get to all of them, I can move on during the Q&A and maybe clarify some of them. The first one, collectives, states, groups, organizations have emotions, and they act on them, and that means that we can't just blame it on 1 or 2 individuals or give 1 or 2 individuals credit for what has happened over the last 10 years. We have to look at what collectives do and what individuals do in their name. Second, power has its limits. There are some things we cannot do, no matter how many pep talks we give ourselves. Third, there were some people that were right in terms of what to do after 9/11 and some people that were wrong, and that should matter. Specifically, I'm going to argue that the foreign policy realists were right, and there were others that were very wrong. Fourth, generations matter. We might think about the last 2 decades, the decade leading up to 9/11, the decade since 9/11, and then the future decades in generational terms as much as we think of them in national terms or political party terms, or what I'd call anymore political tribal terms in this country. And then fifth, if I have a little bit of time, just to remark on what bin Laden's death, which also happened this year, what kind of a meaning it has in terms of the global war on terror and also going forward. Does it signify a break, so to speak, in terms of how we divide up international politics and eras? Just another blip or data point that we might consider amongst other things. Okay, so the first one, collectives or states have emotions and they act on them. One of the things that we've noticed, that I noticed at least on TV when we saw a lot of these retrospectives about 9/11, leading up to the 10th anniversary earlier this month, was that everyone talked about the collective emotion that was in the air after 9/11. And actually both of the panels talked about this fear, right? The collective fear that was out there, not just individuals having fear, but the collective amount of fear that was out there. And I think that's important, and we should think about the context when we go back and we judge or we evaluate some of the policies that were put into place at that time. That was a collective experiencing fear. Now there were also other emotions I think that were collectively circulating in the United States and throughout much of the world at the time. One was sadness or mourning. If we remember how difficult it was, how awkward it was to sort of mourn, and how the United States, other societies know how to mourn collectively. The United States had a little bit of trouble of figuring how to mourn, right? Do we have a moment of silence before even all of the casualties are counted? Do we do something at the Super Bowl? Do we do something on the first anniversary? Anxiety. I think fear is something that was collectively out there, but there was also anxiety that was collectively out there. Fear is something that has a definite object. I don't want to die, period, right? Anxiety is something where we are perplexed because we're not really sure where or when, for instance, another terrorist attack would occur. So I remember those anthrax attacks, and the feeling, that was the feeling, especially in the Midwest. I was in Iowa at the time, of now I really feel vulnerable because I don't know where or when, you know, the next shoe is going to drop. And then I think if we're looking at all these other emotions, we also have to look at a set of emotions that were also circulating shortly thereafter, and that's anger, revenge, and even rage. That's something natural for individuals to feel, and I think that it's something that collectives experience as well. Now, why is this important? Well, I think if that's the case, then we can't just talk about what the Bush administration decided to do, or what Dick Cheney decided to do, or what the Democratic Party, the Republican Party decided to do after 9/11, because these decisions were in a context of the United States feeling something and acting on Collectives have emotions, leaders react to those, and they act on them on behalf of a polity or a community. So I don't ever say that Bush decided to go to war in any of my classes. The United States and its allies decided to fight a certain type of war in Afghanistan, to nation build it to a functioning representative republic. The United States and its allies, different allies, but allies nonetheless, decided to preemptively fight the Iraq War based on a social reality that, as we found out, did not exist in actual reality. So in this sense, then, this notion of security that Professor Gottlieb was talking about takes on a different meaning. The United States was insecure, but insecure in the way that we look at individuals being insecure. When we talk about an individual being insecure, we're not necessarily talking about them feeling threatened in terms of their own survival, but in not knowing who they are or what they are. I think that was happening. And neoconservatism, for all the black eyes that it's taken in the recent years, one of the reasons why it was so powerful at that time, neoconservative rhetoric, philosophy, and so on, is because it's one of those perspectives that can tap into those emotions, for good or bad, whatever we want to call it. And that's something that we have to recognize. So those of us that, and I don't include myself in this, that sort of celebrate the end of neoconservatism, I think we better think twice, because neoconservatism still remains a perspective that can powerfully tap into those emotions and could do so again. Okay. Second lesson, power has its limits, and there are some things we can't do no matter how many pep talks we give ourselves. And another way to look at this is acting is not the same thing as being. What I mean by that is seeming certain about something as a basis for action is not the same thing as being correct. Just seeming certain. And there was a lot of certainty, or at least pep talks after 9/11 about being certain about who we were and what we were going to do. That's not going to get things done in and of itself. So in another sense, we might reconsider what power means. It doesn't mean just to act out, to get others to do what they would not do, but to make sure that we're not getting ourselves to do something we would not do. We might think of a different form of power, and that's power as restraint. Looking back, it's natural, especially with these collective emotions that we had, to want to act, to want to do something in the face of a crisis. But we might think about not acting in certain cases as being an option as well. It's not pretty, it doesn't look good, but having restraint, a sense of stoicism, a poker face, if you will, a sense of calm, can be just as powerful and reassuring, because it means when someone does something threatening or seemingly threatening, they are trying to get the United States or whatever society that they're threatening to do what it would not do. So when Al-Qaeda uses tactics that were out of bounds, which they do, and they did, and they still do, it doesn't mean that we, whoever the we is that's threatened by Al-Qaeda, has to do that as well. So it's not about, so this I think clarifies the phrase that we heard a lot. Senator McCain, for instance, said it a lot over the last decade. It's not about them, it's about us. Self-control is a principle we might think about in the event of future attacks and as a form of power. This also means that there are limits to power, to our ability to change things in the world. So in this sense, idealism, while at times our best friend, and we could use a dose of idealism every once in a while, especially nowadays, but while it can be our best friend, it can also be our worst enemy. Idealism for the United States created a climate where we tripped over ourselves because we didn't cross the T's or dot the I's. Let me shift from metaphor to what I mean precisely by that. We didn't armor the Humvees. We didn't guard the huge caches of weapons depots that we found because we just assumed that the populace would receive us in a friendly manner. Now this isn't a bash the United States talk, just to be clear, it's sort of a be critical of everything talk, because Al-Qaeda also suffered from its own idealistic delusions, its own inability to recognize the limits of its power. For instance, they had the United States bogged down in Iraq with a very favorable Sunni population aiding it from 2003 to 2005, and then what happened? Right? Al-Qaeda forgot that Sunni Iraqis were first and foremost nationalists, more loyal to the idea of liberating their own country than forming a caliphate, more loyal to fighting occupiers than to some radical, twisted vision of Islam. Al-Qaeda suffered from its own idealism that its form of Islam would be received with open arms by Muslims across national lines. There are limits to power, and we can't do everything. Third lesson, some people were right and some people were wrong after 9/11, and that should matter. In this sense, I think the foreign policy realists were right, those that had a certain suggestion on what to do after 9/11 and a particular perspective on the Iraq War. A couple of them, and these are people I don't endorse, I don't support a lot of what they talk about in any other instance, but John Mearsheimer and Stephen Wald, sometimes they're better known for their thesis on the Israel lobby. That's a thesis I'm not going to comment on, I specifically do not endorse it, nor their broader views on Israel. But in January of 2003, they penned an article, or they typed it, nobody pens articles anymore, that appeared in Foreign Policy, the magazine Foreign Policy, in January and February, and they titled the article, "An Unnecessary War." Their argument was that the war would be costly and that containment with Iraq and deterrence were working and would continue to work. They concluded with this assertion at the end of their article, and I quote, "If the United States is or soon will be at war with Iraq, Americans should understand that a compelling strategic rationale is absent. This war would be one the Bush administration," I'd clarify that, I'd say the United States, that's just, okay, that's Brent's interpretation there, "chose to fight," continue quote, "but did not have to fight. Even if such a war goes well and has positive long-range consequences, it will still have been unnecessary. And if it goes badly, whether in the form of high U.S. casualties, significant civilian deaths, a heightened risk of terrorism, or increased hatred of the United States and the Arab and Islamic world, then its architects will have even more to answer for." That's in January of 2003. Not a lot of people were mentioning that. And the point that the realists, and they weren't just academics, there were generals in the military, or former generals like Anthony Zinni, who were also foreign policy realists who were making the same points. The point that they were trying to make is not only that the war might go poorly, but that occupying a country and expended resources would impact the United States' relative power in a negative way. So China, India, Iran, North Korea, Russia, countries that had to expend no resources in such a way would benefit. Iran, which got to trade a secular Sunni regime next door for a Shia-friendly regime, or a relatively friendly regime, seems to have benefited the most. And Iran and North Korea, the two other axis of evil regimes, reacted to the Iraq invasion not by throwing up their hands in intimidation, but by accelerating their nuclear weapons programs. Okay, let me conclude this lesson and then move on to my last two that I'll take in tandem because I know I'm probably running out of time. I think it should matter that the realists are right. Now, they're not always right. I remember in October of 1993, a lot of realists running around and saying, "Black Hawk down, this is why you never intervene in a humanitarian crisis." And they said, you never intervene in a humanitarian crisis, it's never in the national interest. And then 6 months later, 800,000 moderate Hutus and Tutsis were hacked to death by machetes while the world watched on, not considering it in their national security interest to do anything. But at this time they were right, and especially though there were those who were wrong regarding Iraq and 9/11 and what to do afterwards, especially those that predicted the United States would be greeted as liberators and that Iraqis would lead us to the WMDs and that there were WMDs to begin with and that this was a way to fight a global war on terror, that we had to fight them over there so we don't have to fight them here. You wouldn't have to do anything, Sheriff. If we're fighting them over there, we're not going to fight them over here. Okay. And I don't consider myself a foreign policy realist either. I should point that out. I sort of cut my teeth as an academic and a scholar, so to speak, as critiquing the realists. So it sort of pains me to point out that they were right. Fourth and fifth, generations matter and bin Laden's death. Generations matter. I think we should look at the last decade in generational terms as much as we think of them in national terms or sort of political party terms, Democrat versus Republican. Generations matter because the formative experiences of a generation are carried on as lessons that they use to formulate policy when they actually get into power. We should note not only the generation that was in power in the United States, the baby boomers, or the so-called baby boomers, and the formative experiences of the 1960s and 1970s that it used to frame the war on terror. Some people were surprised that the 2004 election was about whether John Kerry had thrown away his ribbons or whether George Bush had fought in the National Guard. It didn't surprise me at all. These are the formative experiences of a generation that's thinking about these things. But we should also think about the generations that were sent off to fight the war on terror from the United States, so-called Gen X and the millennials, and what lessons they might take from policies like preemptive war and nation building when they get into power in the coming decades. What formative experiences over the last decade that they take to sort of formulate policies in the future and whether those will be beneficial or not. And further, I think generations matter in terms of how we come to grips with the changing epoch, or what we see as the so-called Arab Spring. Some people, those who considered Islamic movements through the lens, like a lot of us did, and a lot of my generation did, through the Iranian Revolution, or Islamic Jihad, or Hezbollah, or Hamas from the 1990s, or even Al-Qaeda from the 1990s to 2000s. It's still hard to process the Arab Spring through anything but our old paradigms about radical Islam, protest, revolution equals terrorism. And so this is why we hear, well, the Egyptian Revolution isn't about revolution, it's about Al-Qaeda and the Muslim Brotherhood taking over. Case closed, move on. I think we need to think about how different people process, depending on where they're from and the sort of formative experiences they have, how they process that. Finally, bin Laden's death. How important is it? Does it have a meaning as a sort of USS Missouri moment for the end of the war on terror. Let me clarify what I mean by that. Those of you that have been to Pearl Harbor know that the surrender of the Japanese to U.S. forces was signed right on the deck of the USS Missouri, and they actually have that spot there. Those of you that have been to Pearl Harbor, where you can actually see that. That's a clear-cut moment where a war had started, and it had ended, and it was over, and an occupation began. It's very difficult to be able to say that we're ever going to have a moment like that for the global war on terror. So is that such a moment? Is bin Laden's death such a moment for the global war on terror? I would say a qualified yes, but it has more to do with the fact that it was problematic to call it a war to begin with. And it seems to us to be much more of what we thought terrorism has been, or counterterrorism has been historically, in that it's more of a police operation or special forces operation. But the other thing is not only that it happened, that bin Laden was killed, and the way it was killed, and the way that operation was conducted, and sort of the sense that people were celebrating a death or whatever else, but when it was happening in this Arab Spring. I do think that when we look back at this time, and at least this is how I'm going to organize my international politics courses when I talk about history, I think that we do look at that as a different era is beginning here. And it could be bad and it could be good, but whatever it is, that there is a sort of sense that something is happening, and it is changing us from the 9/11 era or the post 9/11 era to something different. Thank you.
Well, I think our panelists deserve a short round of applause for presenting their perspectives up here and taking the time to join us. And I'd now like to open it to questions from the people assembled here. There's a microphone in the middle of the room, so if anybody has questions that they're interested in asking, make your way to the center. I know you've already heard from me, but I have one question that I'd like to ask Dr. Gottlieb, that's been sticking with me since the middle of the conversation, and that is about the difference between a military and a sort of criminal target in a foreign policy setting. Is that a correct understanding of what you were talking about? I'd like to know more about that.
Well, I think one very specific consequence of thinking in military versus civilian terms that is, or criminal defense terms, is that the amount of force that is permissible when you're in a military engagement, and the kind of proportionality that is permitted, and the circumstances in terms of the amount of suspicion that you have are broader in a military engagement.
Borders or national security, what will we choose? And I argued with his chief of staff to change this because I didn't see this dichotomization is at all sensible. 9 years after this debate, immigration reform at a national level has been sucked up into a vacuum. It's the political third rail of our nation. We've got 28 states that have considered or are considering immigration legislation, probably what I would call in many states hate legislation, all under this guise that somehow we're gonna make ourselves safe by shutting some things down. And yet, there's no national debate on this. I'm just kind of wondering, thinking about this idea of borders and immigration and security and our safety and the public awareness, and how this has devolved to a state level thing, and we're not talking about it at all on a national level. What do you all think about this? I mean, are these things we should be discussing? Are they irrelevant? How does our understanding of 9/11 10 years later affect how that public discourse should be steered in the future?
Well, I mean, you've of course been to the fence that we're building on the Canadian border to protect us from the largest unsecured border. I mean, honestly, there are issues that are worth exploring in any number of dimensions with respect to immigration. I don't think that people coming across the southern border, to the extent that that's an issue, has terribly much to do with the questions of protecting ourselves against another terrorist attack. Now, getting a better track on people who have and are overstaying visas has been something, because some of the 9/11 attackers were here with overstayed visas, is something that the government moved fairly quickly to improve, but I see that as being something different than what you're talking about. I mean, it seems people may kind of use that as a background coloring for the debate, but it seems to me that the debate on immigration ought to proceed along lines that are somewhat distinct from some of the issues that we've been talking about.
One of the issues is the National Sheriff's Association. I mean, it's a big fight up and down, you know, Arizona, New Mexico, and Southern California and Texas, and you know, you don't hear much of it on the northern side, but everybody down there is, you know, what the heck do we do and how do we stop this? And it's like, you know, okay, just continue to throw more money at it, and that's not going to help the issue. But it's how we actively going to fix that issue. I don't see, you know, we're starting to see more in the Midwest. I remember growing up when I was in Colorado, is the Mexican population would come up and be the farm workers, and they'd turn around and go home. I mean, we're starting, I don't ever remember that in Kansas, and then all of a sudden now you're starting to see that issue's starting to come through here. Our issues is, okay, we hold them for somebody, and what do we do with them? I mean, our tax dollars locally are holding them. Okay, what do you want me to do? You know, one day we're saying, oh no, we don't want this one, and tomorrow we'll take that one.
I can't really add too much to. Can you hear me?
It's not on.
Oh,
It's
did
not
I?
on.
Must be an auto shut off.
Or something, or maybe it's just playing tricks on me. I can't really add much to what the other panelists have already mentioned. I mean, it's not unusual, right, to play the security card for a lot of different reasons, right? And so we can make all kinds of national security arguments to justify the policies that we want instituted, or to validate whatever perspectives we already came to the table with to begin with. And it's not just on the issue of immigration, but we did see that, absolutely, right after 9/11. And not just on the issue of visas, but you do see an increase, although it didn't start with 9/11, but an increase in these militias and the Minutemen and so on, trying to defend borders down in Mexico, even though the 9/11 hijackers came through Canada. But on the other hand, you know, people do this as well with healthcare. That's a national security issue, and we need to securitize it and so on. I think the problem with well, there's two ways to think about this. One, it's not unusual historically in the United States or any society that's dealing with migration issues, and Europe is dealing with it in a you know, another context. The UK is dealing with it in another context. It's not unusual to take to see ebbs and flows of different immigration waves, and to see some type of isolation of new populations that are coming in as some sort of different or other or whatever. There are also arguments, I think, that could be made that sort of hit kind of the sweet spot in between, and so you have legislation. You talked about some of the legislation that's problematic at the state level. I think to the extent that the federal government tries to think about these things, you know, the DREAM Act, for example, as a way to kind of look at, you know, instead of just saying, let's just do an amnesty for everybody, or let's just kick all of them out, however that's going to be, however unrealistic that might be, and let's build this fence everywhere, including the Canadian border. let's look at the people that are already here and that are already trying to participate in institutions, whatever those are, academic institutions, economic institutions, whatever. And let's figure out a way to sort of facilitate that and process that. But I think you were exactly right to say this is a false dichotomy in 2002 or even nowadays. I mean, somebody can make an argument. I noticed housing prices are plummeting, right, everywhere, including here. I bought my house in 2005. I'm going to be in it for a while, for obvious reasons. There it is. Battery must be on. Okay, so I guess to conclude my point vocally, you know, that's one thing that if you see immigration waves coming in, I mean, that can be one way to get the housing market back up, right? So there can be all these self-interest reasons for immigration just as much as there are self-interest or identity reasons to want to limit immigration, however feasible that is. But I think more than anything, rather than us having answers, if what you want is just a generation of a debate at the national level. And I think that needs to happen, and it hasn't happened, and to some degree that starts with courage at the political level, rather than anything that any of us might do on the grassroots, or in conjunction with anything that anybody might do at the grassroots level.
At the beginning of the meeting, we had the question, how can we prevent another 9/11 happening? How do you want to answer this question if we don't know what happened exactly on this date, on this day?
Can you clarify what you mean by that?
Did somebody text you that? Or?
No, I'm not very good with English, so I wrote it down.
Oh, I'm sorry. Okay.
Yeah.
Can you say that again, please?
At the beginning of the meeting, we had the question, how can we prevent another 9/11 happening? How do you want to answer this question if we don't know what happened on that day?
So, I mean, are you arguing that it's still not clear?
There are still questions, that's what I'm saying.
Like what questions? I just wanted you to clarify what you mean by that. Because I think I know where you're going with this question, but I just want to make sure before I don't answer or answer.
Right. What brought the towers to fall, for example?
What brought the towers down to fall?
So how do you want to answer this question? There are still different arguments about it.
Well, I mean, there are arguments about what happened to the Jews in World War II as well. And I think that that the Holocaust is a reasonably well-documented historical fact, and I think that as a factual matter, what happened to the towers is pretty well documented. There are issues with respect to the way that they constructed the facade of the building that allowed it to fall down when it was superheated in ways that if planes had gone into the Empire State Building, the Empire State Building would not have fallen down. In my view, we were just, and this may trivialize that horrible event, but we were unbelievably unlucky that day, in my view. But I think the question of, the historical causes is something that can be debated, in my view, more than the question of what happened on that day. And we have the radio intercepts about what was going on in the airplanes on a minute-by-minute basis. There's an incredible book called The Ground Truth that has what the planes were saying to each other on an almost second-to-second basis. So we know the way we responded as well.
I mean, I think I just agree with him. I'm all for re-examining history and the dominant sort of understanding of an event and whatever else. But for me, I think that what happened is what happened. There's not some sort of conspiracy out there that there was some sort of explosion or whatever that actually brought the towers down. Although I'm not somebody that thinks that it's not legitimate to at least ask questions every once in a while. For me, I'm more interested in what types of reasonings produced the event itself, and then what the event has produced, especially what the event has produced since then. The way that the United States, the way that the world community acted in the immediate days after 9/11. In terms of the solidarity, we forget, as sort of fractured as it seems that international society is nowadays, that there was a lot of solidarity at the time with the United States, because many people in the world didn't look at this as just an U.S. American event. This was something that was important globally as well. So, so I think those are the types of questions that I tend to ask, just because I don't have enough time to ask everything. But again, I don't want to begrudge anybody else's skepticism, right?
Dr. Gottlieb, you seem to be fairly critical of the increased security measures since 9/11 with the TSA and whatnot, as somewhat infringing on personal privacy rights and whatnot. And I guess my question is you know, at the risk of not wanting to be insensitive towards 9/11, or like you said, trivialize it. Well, I guess what my question is something like 9/11 inevitable in a society that wants to preserve privacy rights and that wants to preserve you know, rights against the searches and seizures like the TSA and things of those natures? And you know, is that inevitable? Was 9/11 inevitable? And what maybe could we have done beforehand without necessarily invoking on those rights?
Short question. I didn't really mean to say that the government, except in a few instances where the government was acting secretly and we didn't know what they were doing, was infringing privacy rights, because most of the things that I talked about were things that we willingly were willing to give up. And so it's the choices. I mean, the public changes that have been made are choices that we as a society have been willing to accept. So I mean, to the extent that I was hoping that there was some willingness to think about this, it's thinking about it. My own personal view with respect to TSA is that there are obviously things that we could and should have been doing before that we weren't doing, and I think that there are clearly things that we're doing now that we don't have to be doing, and you know, we should, it seems to me, continually monitor this. We should be checking what we do against what other democratic systems do. If Europe has been able to get along for 10 years without making everybody take off their shoes, maybe that's something that we don't really have to do, or we could at least be involved in deciding whether that's something that's necessary when we fly from Kansas City to Milwaukee. So I mean, to start out with, I don't look at these as infringements. I look at these as choices that we've made that we are free to re-examine. I mean, with respect to the, you know, what happened before 2001, and there's a pretty rich literature and there's been people like Richard Clarke have talked a lot about decisions that they, in terms of intelligence, that they would have liked to allow the United States to do. One big thing, which actually related a little bit to the question of you know, getting messages from other people, was the view that we weren't sharing enough from agency to agency in September 11th. And so what we needed to do is to have domestic and foreign intelligence talking to each other more. You know, we're not going to stop every terrorist attack that occurs, and to be really honest, it's not just because we're a democracy, because dictatorships aren't able to stop terrorist attacks otherwise. I mean, it's frustrating for me to hear a war against a tactic, because, I mean, eventually that tactic may succeed, and it doesn't mean that you're losing the war.
Thanks. And then I have another question for Dr. Steele. You talked a lot about collective emotions and collective fear and collective anger, and you touched on a little bit of maybe a response of collective self-control and trying to promote that. And I guess it's a real general question, but my question is maybe how, at a federal or even a state level, what can the government do to promote this collective self-control so that maybe in the future we respond to something like that with more self-control?
That's a good question. And it's a question that shows the difference between being an academic and being able to say this is what we should do, and then not actually having to follow it up with this is how we would actually do it. Because I mean, honestly, I'm not exactly sure how you go about doing that. Some of it would be a re-examination of the conventional wisdom on what we want leaders to do in a time of crisis, right? I think one of the metaphors I use sometimes, and when I'm trying to talk about this sense of self-control as being something that's also powerful, one of the examples I give, and it's probably a bad example, and it's probably why my students don't get a lot out of my classes, is that, among other things, is that if we remember, one of the first times, if any of us did this, I did it a lot, where we fell off our bike, right, and we were really upset, or we hit a curb or a sidewalk that had a crack in it, and if that crack hadn't been there, we wouldn't have fallen off the bike, right? And we go crying to our parents, our dad or our mom, and we say, if I wouldn't have hit this crack, I wouldn't have fallen off the bike. What is it that we want the parent to do in that situation? Do we want them to immediately or very quickly thereafter go and find the neighbor that didn't have the sidewalk fixed and yell at them and scream at them and do something so that in the future that would never happen? Or do we want them just to be the voice of reason, to calm us down? Most children, at least my children, I don't always practice what I preach, they want more of the voice of reason, the sense of calm. I don't know if we always expect that out of our politicians. Sometimes we get upset at our politicians when they're not getting angry, right? When they're not passionate about everything. But, and I think that's the conventional wisdom of what we expect. So some of it is going to have to be re-examining this sense of conventional wisdom where we want somebody to be aesthetically sort of upset or angry or passionate or inspiring or whatever during a time of crisis, and instead we want them to just be calm. And we do have some politicians that do that. I think President Bush, in certain moments, he gave a speech about 6 days after to Congress that was actually very reassuring. It wasn't about revenge. It was about reassuring, and it was about this is what we're going to do. We're going to think through this. So politicians are capable of it during certain moments. Everyone talks about Winston Churchill, right, and what he was like at that time. So I think some of it has to come from the leadership. And so that gets to your question, but some of it also has to come from us. And sort of an admission of what Professor Gottlieb says, that we can't prevent everything, right? I mean, knowing that power has its limits means that the world isn't perfect and we're not going to be able to prevent every bad thing from happening. And so it's all about knowing how do you control yourself when some of those things that happen that are inevitable, that are inevitably going to happen somewhere at some time. It's about reacting to that. So again, it's not something that's going to be popular. Politicians are going to be very tempted to play on that, and it's going to be to their benefit. But I think that's where it gets to the relationship between what we expect out of good leaders and what we expect out of good citizens as well.
I'd like to thank our panelists again for taking the time to join us today. Whatever it is that we do going forward, one thing we know that to sow the seeds of peace will require relationships across group lines and a great understanding of the differences between cultures and between faiths. And so I also commend you all for taking the time today to come to a place where you can learn about other traditions and participate in the interfaith dialogue, and commend participating in that more in the future. This is an opportunity that we have to make a difference, even though we're just people in this community. So I hope you have a good day. Go in peace.